Okay, guys, today is a huge day in world history class. We are going to officially start World War II. For the last week and a half to 2 weeks, we've been building up for this moment. And in 1939, the world decides to go back to war. Now, today, we're going to talk for a long time about the introduction. We're still not going to start the war. That's going to come in our next class period. So let's get ready for our good introduction. First thing we're going to talk about, obviously, are the causes of World War II. One main cause is obviously World War One, and then the Treaty of Versailles. We talked about how the Treaty of Versailles was not very well liked by the Germans, and obviously they're not going to listen to the Treaty of Versailles, and they're not going to follow it or anything that it provided for. Now, one thing that you guys did a great job on was working on the outline on the totalitarian dictatorships that formed. Okay, so Hitler, is going to form his totalitarian government in Germany. Mussolini is going to form his totalitarian government in Italy. And there's going to be a wild card here that you got a little introduction to when we talked about our lesson on the threats to world peace. And it's going to be the Japanese with their leader Hideki Tojo, who's going to be looking to not just create and expand his territory, but maybe create an empire over there in the Pacific, like you read about before this class. So World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and these totalitarian governments that we spent a lot of time on are going to cause World War II. Now, let's be specific. Japan's going to take a place called Manchuria in China in 1931. Okay, so World War II starts in 1939. The Japanese are going to be extremely aggressive. Now, they're going to go into China, and at one point, they're going to have a quarter of China that belongs to them, and they're going to create what we call a puppet state. A puppet state, like a puppet is definitely maneuvered by the person that is working the puppet. So you can imagine Japan has total control over this area. Now, they're going to call it Manchukuo, and the League of Nations did not agree with this because it was a direct attempt to take over territory that didn't belong to them. And in 1931, you just didn't do that. So the League of Nations does not agree, but in 1932, the League of Nations said bye-bye to the Japanese, and they left the League of Nations. Now, the Japanese are going to have a conflict with China all the way to the end of World War II in 1945. But in 1939, about one quarter of China did belong to Japan. And the Chinese and the Japanese really did not like each other during this time period in our world. Okay? So that conflict will take place with China all the way till the end of the war, starting with this little puppet state called Manchukuo that the Japanese are going to create in China. Now, we talked about in your reading, Mussolini conquers Ethiopia in 1936. Well, if you recall from our prior lessons, during the age of imperialism, we talked about one of the biggest military embarrassments in the history of our world. And it was when Italy went into Ethiopia. Now, if you remember, the Ethiopians fought them off, and they remained independent during the age of imperialism. Well, Mussolini is going to remember that. So fast forward to 1936. Mussolini is going to roll into Ethiopia and is going to take it and basically tell the Ethiopians, hey, you guys remember when you defeated us in 1896? That is not going to happen again. So the League of Nations was not real happy with Italy. And remember, Italy was a founding member of the League of Nations. They put sanctions on them. They said that no one was allowed to sell or trade oil or iron or steel, things that were needed to make weaponry, to Italy anymore. Now, these sanctions that the League of Nations were not very well enforced. And in fact, Italy says goodbye to the League of Nations in 1937. So you can see the ineffectiveness. That was part of your answer in your homework, was the ineffectiveness of the League sanctions and its ineffectiveness in general. So Italy is gone from the League of Nations in 1937. Now, here's Hitler. So Hitler decides to directly violate the Treaty of Versailles. Now, behind the scenes, we know that Germany had been definitely violating the Treaty of Versailles for a long time. Well, here's the first direct violation of the treaty. Now, if you look at the map, Hitler is going to invade a territory called the Rhineland in 1936. You can see that the Rhineland is situated right between France and Germany, and there's a lot of German speakers there. Now, this area used to belong to the Germans, but was given back to France throughout the years and after World War I. Well, they wanted it back. So he rightfully, he felt, rode into the Rhineland. Well, it didn't have any effect on the League of Nations because he had already told the League of Nations goodbye in 1933. So he had dropped out a long time before that. Now, this is the first time that you can stop in the notes, and I'd like for you to go to Shobi. I'd like for you to watch the little video on the Rhineland. When you're done answering the questions and watching that quick video, come back to the notes and we will continue. So here's where we get the name, the Axis Powers. So the Axis Powers is named between the alliance that was formed between Italy, Germany, and Japan. It's going to be called the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis. It was formed in 1936, and that name will stick as one of the alliances for World War II. It was called the Axis Power. Now, these guys tried to justify it because they were all socialist leaders, fascist dictators, and they justified having this alliance for the bigger scheme of trying to fight the communists. That's how they tried to justify this alliance, socialism versus fascism. Now, there's a really important event that we alluded to in our lessons leading up to this lesson. It was called the Spanish Civil War, and it happened from 1936 to 1939. And it's a big deal because it almost started World War II. Now, in Spain, Spanish people were broken into two different groups. They were called the Nationalists, which were led by the Socialists, the Fascists, led by their leader, Franco, and the Loyalists, who were in favor of a democracy, who supported the old Spanish Republic that had formed. Now, the Nationalists were led by this guy, Franco. Now, you would think, like, well, why the heck is the Spanish Civil War an event that's going to start World War II? Well, being that the Nationalists in the war were socialists, they were going to get aid and they were going to have support from other socialist countries in the world. So I would ask you in the classroom, what big socialist countries would come to the aid of Franco and the fascists in the Civil War? And you would tell me that Italy and Germany would support the nationalists or the socialists in this Spanish Civil War. Now, you would also ask, well, what did that have to do with the loyalists? Well, these loyalists, these people in Spain, these Spanish people that were loyal to the old democracy, why would that be important in the world? Well, what groups of people would come to the support of the loyalists? Well, those would be the major democracies of the world. Now, you would say that France and Great Britain and the United States would lead that crew. And you're exactly right. They did support the loyalists in the Spanish Civil War. There would be one wild card there, and it would be the Soviet Union, because there's a central theme that we're going to learn today, that the socialists and the communists just did not get along. So the communists would have supported the loyalists in the Spanish Civil War against the fascists, against the socialists in that group, which we call the nationalists. Now, there's a real famous event that happens here in the Spanish Civil War. It happens on April 26, 1937. Now, the Germans are going to attack a small little farming town in Spain called Guernica. They're going to send on that day 28 high-level bombers to basically just bomb and air raid this small Spanish rural town. Now, on that day, 1,600 people are going to die. Now, what historians call this event is a dress rehearsal for World War II. What that means is the Germans wanted to see and show off their guns. They wanted to see what their bombers can do. And it's one of the most unjustified events ever in the history of our world. Why would they do that? Well, they wanted to show off their guns and they wanted to see how everything would work. Well, there's a real famous Spanish artist named Pablo Picasso. And if you're looking at that picture, you can obviously tell that's a Picasso. And the name of this painting is called Guernica. Now, what Picasso shows in this painting is the destruction and the irrationality of this event. And it's painted in grays, whites, and blacks. Now, you can see that there are a couple symbols here. You can see mothers holding their dead children in their arms. The bull is supposed to be a symbol of strength in Spain. You know, the bullfights and so on. You can see irrationality, you can see destruction in this painting, but you always ask me about the light bulb at the top of this painting. Well, what does a light bulb represent in 1937? Well, a light bulb would represent technology, and Picasso painted that to show the technology according to the weaponry that the Germans had, the technology that they showed the Spanish people of Guernica that day. Now, one fun fact about this painting is that when World War II started, the painting Guernica was actually on, it was being shipped all over the world. It was on tour, is what I'm trying to say. And it happened to be in New York City. And in fact, it remained in New York City until the 1980s when the Spanish wanted this painting back. So fortunate for this painting and fortunate for this famous Picasso, it was safe and it exists, and it was turned back to Spain in the 1980s. Now, you're going to see a central trend here at the beginning of the war of Germany being very aggressive, which is meant by German aggression, compared to a new policy that the Western countries were going to practice at the beginning of World War II called appeasement. Now, appeasement almost has the word peace in it, and it means it's giving in to demands in order to keep the peace. So the Germans were being aggressive here at the beginning of the war, and the Western countries like France and Great Britain and the United States were appeasing. They were giving in and saying, okay, no problem, Germany, if you want to take the Rhineland, for example, we are going to appease and practice this policy of appeasement. Well, why? Why were the Western countries appeasing and giving in to Hitler's demands and basically just allowing him to do what he wanted at the beginning of the war? Well, number one, France was still hurting from World War I. They were the biggest loser. There was no way that France was ready to go to war in 1939. So they gave in to a lot of Hitler's demands. Now, the British listened to what they had to say. The British felt like the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh on the Germans, way too harsh on the Germans. And the British actually felt sorry for Germany. That's why the British decided to appease. They gave in to Hitler's demands and kind of allowed for him to do what he wanted because they felt sorry for Hitler and they felt sorry for the Germans according to the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Western countries were giving in a little bit because they kind of felt like the socialists, the fascists, were eventually going to fight the communists. So the Western democracies were kind of holding out a little bit to see if this little war would come to fruition, where maybe the Soviet Union would go to war against Hitler and the Italians. And they would wait it out a little bit. That's why they were giving in a little bit to see if this fascism versus communism little war might actually happen. Well, another thing that affected the world, and definitely the Western democracies, was the Great Depression. So we were all struggling from the Depression still. And remember, the Americans affected the world economy. The Great Depression definitely affected the world's economy, and economically, none of those Western democracies were ready to go to war in 1939. Well, there was also this policy or this theory of pacifism that was going on in the world. Now, pacifism is very easy to understand. Many of you can relate to this. You don't like to fight. You simply just are against going to war, and you don't like to fight. And after the destruction of World War I, you can see, while there was a big cloud of pacifism over Europe, they didn't want to go through this again. Now, the last thing that really affected Britain and France, allowing for the Germans to pretty much do a little bit of what they wanted at the beginning of the war, is that the United States made it very clear that they were going to practice isolationism again. In fact, we actually passed 3 different neutrality acts, meaning that if war were ever again to break out in Europe, we were going to be neutral. We were not going to take a side. And that obviously affected the British and the French in letting Hitler do a little bit of what he wanted. So, if you're Hitler, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to be aggressive. And you are going to start to take a lot of territory. And that's exactly what Hitler did. So in March of 1938, after taking the Rhineland, he's going to annex Austria. Austria, the country that borders Germany to the south. There's a word that in German that means Anschluss. That means a union with Austria. Hitler always wanted to have a union with Austria. And it's very personal for Hitler because he is from Austria. And the other thing was, I would ask you a question of what is the national language of Austria? It's not Austrian, it's German. They're German speakers. So naturally, Hitler felt that he should have Austria. Now, annex means to take it outright. So in March of 1938, Hitler literally rolls into Austria and takes it. Well, there's a real two good stories about this. Number one, the Chancellor of Austria, the leader of Austria, gave Hitler a little timeout, and he said, well, Hitler, maybe the Austrian people should vote on this to see if Germany should be allowed to take us outright. And Hitler looked at him and said, there will be no vote. You now belong to us. Now, another good story about the annex of Austria has to do with the famous movie, The Sound of Music. And I know there are a lot of Sound of Music fans in the crowd. Well, if you recall, throughout that entire movie, and definitely at the end, the Von Trapp family is running from the Nazis. They're running from the Germans because that movie took place in Salzburg, Germany. So the Hills Were Alive and The Sound of Music, this is the time when Hitler and the Germans are going to take Austria. And remember, the family was running from the Nazis. They were running from the Germans at the end of the movie. So he's going to take the Rhineland on the western border of Germany. Now he's going to take Austria. Now, in September of 1938, Hitler takes a place called the Sudetenland. Now, the Sudetenland is the western part of Czechoslovakia, and it is home to 3 million Germans. 3 million Germans. Now, Hitler felt like since those are all German people, that area should belong to Germany. Well, guess what he did? He took it, and it was justified because there are all those German speakers in the western part of Czechoslovakia that used to belong to Germany, okay? Now, at this point, I want you guys to stop, and I want you to go to Shobi, and I want you to watch the two videos, the next two, one on the Sudetenland and answer the question, and the other one on Austria. Austria first, and then the Sudetenland. When you're done, come back to the note session, and we'll continue and finish up for the day. Now, in September of 1938, after taking the Rhineland, and after annexing Austria, and after taking the Sudetenland, the western part of Czechoslovakia, Hitler does something pretty smart on his part. He's going to have a meeting. He's going to have the Munich conference, a conference that's going to take place in Munich, Germany, in September of 1938. And he's actually going to invite the leaders of England and France to sit down and have a little meeting. Well, the picture, you can see Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of Britain during this time, 1938, Edward Daladier, who was the French leader, the French premier. Hitler's in the middle. You can see Mussolini to Hitler's left. And then you see a guy named Ciano, who was Mussolini's right-hand man. Now, at the Munich conference, the Western democracies, England and France, told Hitler that, listen, can you please stop taking territory? I mean, we have a relationship with Czechoslovakia. We don't think it's right that you are continuing to take territory. Is there any way that you can stop taking this territory? Well, at the end of this meeting, Hitler promised to stop taking land. The British Prime Minister went back home and said, hey, this Hitler, he's not such a bad guy. He promised that he would stop taking land. The French Prime Minister went back to France and said, listen, war has been avoided, all right? Hitler pleaded and told us and promised us that he would stop taking land. Now, the Munich conference happened in September of 1938, and this was the result of it. Hitler promised to stop taking land. Well, the winter of 1938 and 1939 had passed, and Hitler was such a great guy and had such a great promise at the Munich conference. In March, he took all of Czechoslovakia. So at this point, March 1939, after he took all of Czechoslovakia, you can see that he kind of is making a military buffer around Germany. He's taken territories right along the German border. He took the Rhineland, he took Austria, he took Czechoslovakia, and including the Sudetenland. So you can see exactly what he's trying to do on this image. Now, tomorrow, you're going to have to wait to see what he takes next. At this point, I need for you to stop, watch a quick little video on Czechoslovakia, and then come back to me. Now, after taking Czechoslovakia, one of the most devastating things that could have happened to Britain and France and the Allies before this war even started is going to happen. It's one of the most famous events of World War II. And it has something to do with something called the Nazi-Soviet Pact. You are not going to believe this, and the world did not believe this in August of 1939. In August of 1939, the unthinkable happened. The Germans and the Soviets are going to sign a peace treaty, and it's going to be the very famous Nazi-Soviet pact. It's called that because of the Nazis and the Soviets. Now, this was signed. Now, what this was a non-aggression treaty. It stated if war were to break out, the Germans and the Soviets would not fight each other. They would not fight each other. Another thing that they did was they divided up Poland. They cut Poland right in half. Poor little Poland. The western part belonged to Germany, and the eastern part belonged to the Soviet Union. Now, the reason why this was so devastating to Europe was for the same reasons that happened in World War I. When the Russians ousted themselves from World War I, there was no more Eastern Front, and the Germans could focus totally on the Western Front. Well, guess what? Fast forward 20 years. With the Soviets signing the Nazi-Soviet pact with the Germans, guess what? If war were to break out, there would be no Eastern Front. Hitler would not have to send Germans to the Russian border. He could focus all of his intentions on the West, and France and Britain would be doomed. And that's how the Nazi-Soviet pact is going to play out. Now, this is where we're going to end for the day. We're going to go back and we're going to do a little lesson on the Nazi-Soviet pact. Part 2, you will take on this note session at your next class period.